Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host Dr. Reid Robison and I discuss how to set healthy boundaries so that your relationships can be energizing and your mental wellness can flourish. Is that an overpromise? I hope not. Today Reid and I discuss why having boundaries is so important. We talk about different types of boundaries that one can set. We go on some weird tangents about quantum fields and the nature of consciousness. Hope you enjoy that. And we give you some hot tips on how to set healthy boundaries. Why are we releasing this episode now? Well, it's the holidays, folks. Hopefully it's self-evident. Like a lot of us have trouble setting boundaries with family members in particular. So we hope that this will be instructional, useful to you. If you like the show and you want to know how you might support us, there's a few ways. You can email us suggestions and gentle or scathing criticisms. Take your pick. Our new email address is ptfpodcast@numinous.com. If you're feeling generous, you can leave us a review on the particular podcast player you're listening on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the like. Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, make comments on the video, and share it with somebody who you think might need to hear a message about boundaries. How about that? Thank you for listening as always, and I hope you enjoy the show. Reid, we're going to talk about boundaries today.
Sweet.
Why they're important, why we want to have healthy boundaries, maybe even some tips on how to cultivate healthy boundaries.
Why are we going to talk about boundaries, Steve?
Because I have terrible boundaries. This is an invention for Steve.
No, I love the topic. It's important, I feel, to take an inventory of our boundaries in so many different facets of life. You know, we'll talk about these, but like time boundaries, not just physical boundaries, but emotional ones, and all the energy leaks that come from people like projecting things onto us, pushing our buttons or reacting at us that we might inappropriately take on or let through.
Yeah, I like the idea of energy leaks. I have a friend who, he goes through this meditation about boundaries where he just closes his eyes, pictures all the different people who are trying to pull things from him or put things on him as these tendrils that are connected to him. And for those people that he wants to, he will sort of pull off the connectors, reach up and connect them to source, is what he says. Connect them to God. Like, I can't give you what you need, plugging you into God, good luck. And then the ones that he doesn't care to do that for, then he'll just imagine himself shattering those connections. And he's got this little force field around him that helps his boundaries, that helps him stay attuned to self.
Yeah, I love that visual or that practice. It reminds me of the practices of like writing things down and burning them, or cord cutting kind of meditations and visualizations, because we do accumulate, I don't know, what I like to call unconscious contracts, like through our lack of healthy boundaries, perhaps, or just through the patterns we develop. You know, there are these expectations that we might self-sacrifice or give of our time, or have overly porous or rigid boundaries. And then when we transform and change and do our work, that can be really uncomfortable or surprising to others. So yeah, there's a lot here. And so why don't we take a step back and look at what boundaries are?
Yeah. Yeah. Or why they're so important. So let's say it this way. Let's lead into it this way. That belonging, right? Human beings' need to belong is a fundamental, bottom of the pyramid, basic human need. And it's a human need that I think evolved as we sort of evolved through hunter-gatherer societies as a social protection system. Like we need to belong, because in those early societies, if there weren't a lot of lone wolves that survived, right? You relied on your tribe, on your community to keep you alive.
To fight tigers.
Exactly. Or other human beings from other tribes or whatever.
Yep.
And it's, in fact, I pulled a quote from one of my favorite books, Transcend by Scott Barry Kaufman, about sort of a reimagining of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
So about belonging, he says, the need for connection, to form and maintain at least a minimal number of positive, stable, intimate relationships, is a fundamental need that affects our whole being, permeating our entire suite of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. While individuals differ in the strength of this need, connection is an irreducible, undeniable human need. The need for connection actually consists of two sub-needs, he says. A, the need to belong, to be liked, to be accepted, and B, the need for intimacy, mutuality, and relatedness.
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start, because it's fascinating to think about how so many of our needs, like the ones you rattled off, or put another way, just like the need to be seen, understood, loved, celebrated, belong, they're all the needs of interbeing, the needs of belonging and interrelating with other humans.
And I like that he said that the strength of this need differs based on the individual. So some individuals might have like a stronger belonging need than others, but with some very, very few exceptions, I think it's present in all of us.
Yeah, and part of it is dictated by one's attachment style too, and that's shaped by, in large part, not entirely, but by your life experiences. And if you're anxiously attached, you really feel the need to have someone else there, or avoidant. You might think you have less of that need, or you might show up with less of that need, but in the end, it's still there. There's this innate need to connect with other humans.
Yeah, and that's sort of the driving force that leads to these different attachment styles that we develop when we're young. If we have a chaotic environment, or an invalidating environment, or a traumatic, abusive or neglecting environment, we're still trying to negotiate this need to be, like you said, to be seen, to be loved, to be accepted, to be wanted, to be nurtured. And so we come up with these strategies when we're young that, which are, decent strategies by one interpretation. But as we evolve, as we get older, they become self-defeating, or they don't serve us anymore, like the anxious attachment style, being too clingy or codependent, for example.
And essentially to avoid the pain of the opposite of those needs.
Yeah, being alone, being rejected, being unseen, isolated.
So we have these needs. Everyone is in the middle of their own life story. And your life story is made up by what you say yes to, what you say no to. And those yeses and nos are your boundaries.
Yeah, I like that way of looking at it. And I've heard it said that yes and no, in and of themselves, are complete sentences. A lot of us who are sort of anxiously attached, or we have these sort of nice guy, nice gal syndromes where we feel like we have to please everybody. We have to make sure the peace is kept, or else we feel uncomfortable. If we try to set a boundary with a no, sometimes we feel this pressure to explain, to give caveats.
What's interesting is, we have this inner compass that helps guide us, and we can talk about that. Our emotions, our mind, thinking, our heart, our gut. But when we say no to someone, there is a very real chance of that person being irked by it, getting upset, even reacting at us. And then that creates, interestingly, another opportunity to practice boundaries, because their reaction is a reflection of, their inner world. And especially in a maladaptive, reactive anger situation, it's not ours to take on. So we have another chance right there. It's not an easy practice. Like, we've all felt this, to hold your ground and not take it on when it's not yours.
Yeah, not take it on when it's not yours. People who were raised in families where they were made to believe that they were responsible for either their parents or their siblings or whatever for their emotional states, they have a really hard time with this. They have a hard time even believing that they aren't responsible for the emotional reactions of others, especially when they're setting boundaries. So, I've heard my clients say, I don't want to make them mad. I don't want to upset them. I don't want to inconvenience them. I don't want it to be rude to them. So they're worried about what their no is going to do to that person. And then behind that is, I also don't want them to reject me. I don't want them to stop loving me. I don't want to feel unimportant or unneeded.
I remember a therapy session I had a couple of years ago. I was looking back at notes the other day, coincidentally, and saw this funny analogy that the therapist gave me when we were talking about people-pleasing tendencies and boundaries. And she just pointed out that, that if you're worried about making someone uncomfortable, so you avoid triggering anything, you avoid saying no so you don't have them have an uncomfortable emotion, you're just really making them stay longer in their own dog poo, she said. Like, do you really want that for them? Like, no growth happens in absolute comfort, right? And, the discomfort is okay. And we're so scared of it as humans sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Allowing other people to experience their own dog poo. So they can learn from that experience, right? Hopefully.
Yeah. And so they can grow. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the clients that I work with and myself, as I've explored my own boundaries, struggle with is this idea of being mean, right? Of being cruel.
Yeah.
And they overinterpret their setting of their own boundaries as being mean, maybe because they were trained to believe that way when they were younger, either implicitly or explicitly. And we should probably make a distinction between one end of the spectrum and the other, right? There's over accommodation, and then there's maybe boundaries that are too harsh. Like there are a lot of a-holes that hide behind the idea of boundaries who are just like, probably super selfish, and it's all about them. And well, I'm going to express my opinion, and if you don't like it, you can go to hell. It's your problem what you feel in response to what I say. But I think we can still have good, healthy boundaries and have tact and have timing and have compassion and be kind.
Yeah. In that, I think it was that same therapy session. It was pretty funny because this therapist was pointing out something we know about, read about, hear about from like Carl Jung, of we all have everything in us, the dark and the light. Mm-hmm. And there's a tendency for some of us humans to think it's all light and to never display anger, thinking that's bad. And she was just reminded me, she's like, when you have a good heart, you will show, and you have good boundaries and you have good authenticity of self. You will show up in a way that's required by the moment. And even if that means you're showing up in a moment as she said, demon bitch from hell, like that is what is required of the moment. You're doing that not because you want to harm someone, it's because you love yourself and the other person. And it may have been a hell no, and that may have been what's required in the moment to protect a boundary for self and others and, everyone you love.
I like that. I like that, especially the idea that setting a boundary is an expression of love to yourself. And a lot of people who struggle with healthy boundary setting don't have a lot of self-worth. They don't have a good sense of self-esteem, perhaps. So even the idea of self-care or setting a boundary as an expression of love to self is a little... there's some cognitive dissonance there.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to reconcile this idea that they are a loved person with this belief that they've developed that they're not a lovable person.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point to think about while parenting, while, raising kids, to be able to check in with oneself and have a preference, have an opinion, to actually try it on, because there's a risk of numbing out our inner compass, making it so distant. And like in religious situations, for example, there's often a guilt or a feeling like you have to say yes to everything you're asked of, without checking in with yourself. But the checking in with yourself and seeing what is true for you is such an important thing to cultivate and maintain.
Yeah, man. That idea of having to say yes to everything that is asked of you is a recipe for porous boundaries, right?
It's self-sacrificing, and like self-sacrificing, we use it, we use that term sometimes, but if you really think about what it means, like killing a part of yourself, do you really want to be doing that?
Right. Yeah. And again, we want to be nuanced about this. In my opinion, I think it is healthy to be altruistic. It is healthy to make sacrifices, but I think to serve others, sometimes when it's not super convenient for you, that can be really healthy. But it should come from this place of judicious expenditure of your resources, your time, your finances.
Yeah.
Exactly, because you want to, not because you feel compelled to, not because you're worried if you don't, you'll be alone, or that people will hate you, or that you'll damage people. There's something that feels really different to serve another person when it comes from this place of abundance, where your teacup is so full, you can give of the excess. You're not scraping the bottom of the cup to give them the last drop that you have.
Yeah, because there are some things like quietly self-sacrificing against your inner compass that drains your cup and builds resentment in its place, or things that can be toxic. Yeah.
Yeah. Resentment is sort of that sometimes unrecognized feeling tone that is underneath the nice guy or the nice gal. Like they tend to be more passive in the ways they try to get love and resent these, because of these contracts you mentioned earlier are unconscious. The other people aren't aware that they're in the gig, like that they're in this contract. And so it's not hard for the person to be like, man, I bend over backwards for everybody. I'm the one who's always accommodating. I'm the one who's always making sacrifices, and nobody appreciates me. And they get a little butthurt about it. But yeah, I mean, if you don't make your needs known, you can't expect people to meet them. One thing I'll say to my clients sometimes is that if you continue to be the path of least resistance for other people, don't get upset when they continue to take it.
Yeah,
people will take the path of least resistance. So, don't let people exploit you.
Yeah, that speaks to the difficulty of these unconscious contracts, or those ways we show up. And then when we have a moment of enlightenment, awakening, whether it's in our own work, walking through life, or in a therapy session, a psychedelic session where you have more awareness, you're like, oh no, I've been doing this. And then you go out in the world. That's part of the challenge of integration. You go down the mountain and you go to family dinner and you're asked the same question. And, that's when you really have to either talk about the unspoken things before, like share following your intuition with how you're changing and why, and just like shore up that authenticity of self to hold your ground through the important boundaries you've realized you need to maintain.
Yeah, it takes some work, doesn't it, to shore up that authenticity of self.
Yeah, that's why they talk about, like, in a psychedelic session, you should account for a lot of time, more than we think, for the integration process, because, insights are one thing, but putting them into action is a practice that requires repeated effort over time, and you're not going to get it perfect immediately. And that takes many-fold more times than the psychedelic session, or even perhaps the preparation does.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I think so. Especially when we're trying to change something that is, the program that was laid down early in life.
Yeah.
That, we've developed in order to protect parts of ourselves that feel really unsafe.
You don't undo it overnight, something that's been there for, 100 years.
Yeah, not typically, right?
Yeah.
And so when you notice, like, if you're a person who historically historically has struggled with boundary setting, you might notice that when you start doing it, things get worse before they get better for you emotionally, right?
Yeah.
You're really uncomfortable.
That's how it can feel. Like a client might have this awareness, this moment of awakening, be like, okay, I'm going to go show up in this new way in my partnership or with my parents. And then the parents are like reacting, saying, or the partner just like, what is with you? Or like, you don't like, I don't like this therapy you're doing, or this is all uncomfortable. This is not smooth. And it might feel like things got worse when it's really both the practice and highlighting the need for attention to the facets of these boundaries and the reaction of others, like being aware of what might happen and communicating that both proactively and as it comes up.
Yeah. It's also a good litmus test for the kinds of relationships you might want to keep versus the kinds of relationships you might want to shave off. It's a lot harder to shave off or to distance yourself from people who are really close to you, like family members, of course. But when people really, really resist in the way that you're describing, it's, because they're used to you playing a certain role that, like I described, was the path of least resistance for them. So they're not going to love it. They're not going to love that you're now not convenient for them all the time. There was a B in there, but I lost track of my... Anyway, you want people around you who really appreciate the fact that you are training them, teaching them, showing them how you want to be treated. Because then they know, like, it's not a mystery. Oh, Steve doesn't love it when I pressure him to do X. So I love Steve. And so I'm no longer going to pressure him to do X. We're going to negotiate that relationship differently. It's going to be more of a negotiation than a demand.
Yeah, it speaks to in partnerships, there's really a commitment to like do the work together, to learn and grow together, an acceptance of where you both are, self and other, and a commitment to do the work together, knowing that like the only predictable thing is change and unfolding, And that's where people get hung up, is like, oh, you changed. That's not convenient, like you said, or not what I signed up for. But when what you're really signing up for is a conscious path together.
Right. Yeah, a conscious path together.
With uncomfortable moments of growth.
Yeah, and I think healthy relationships that are built around healthy boundary setting, they have this sort of foundation of trust, of giving each other the benefit of the doubt, that in this bidirectional way is also built by setting and keeping healthy boundaries, I think. It's a lot easier for me to give my partner the benefit of the doubt when I know she's going to give it to me. It's a lot easier for me to respond in a healthy way to her boundary setting when she does the same for me. This healthy reciprocity that is really hard to do when there isn't trust, when there isn't a history, a track record of giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And conceding sometimes. Conceding sometimes. It's a negotiation as you go.
So types of boundaries, we were talking about attachment style. You could look at boundaries as a similar kind of thing. Like we may be, the pendulum of our boundaries in different areas of life might swing more towards rigid or more towards porous boundaries. Healthy boundaries are that balanced place we strive for, with the understanding that we're never perfectly balanced. We're never perfect humans. That's part of the deal. But I like to look at it that way of if you're too rigid in your boundaries, you're closing off to intimacy, connection, giving and receiving love. If you're too porous in your boundaries, then all the other sides of that coin come into being, of like, having your boundaries violated and not, not respecting self, getting violated, taken advantage of, depleting your energetic cup.
Right. Yeah. And people who are on the more porous side, they sometimes have a hard time knowing who they are and what they want, especially if they grew up that way. I've worked with clients when we're doing this boundary work, and we're finally getting to a place where they're considering what they want out of life, what they want to do with their time, how they want to spend their energy. And for a lot of them, it's actually really hard because they've been taking cues from the needs of others. Like, oh, what do I want? I want to make you happy. Like, what do I want to do with my time? Whatever you want to do. Where do you want to go for dinner? I don't know. It can be really hard for people like that.
Yeah, it's making me think of one personality disorder in particular that, we could look at not just as a personality disorder, because disorders are a dumb term in my opinion.
Problematic,
but there are issues with labels, but the traits of that, like borderline personality disorder, for example, is one where it's kind of has a classic struggle with boundaries and porous boundaries. And what you were saying made me think of how that does stem from, in many cases, a lack of solid identity and sense of self. So you're more likely to latch on in an anxious way, or to like have these porous boundaries without that secure sense of self.
Yeah, and oftentimes, those traits are developed as a result of trauma related to boundaries. Sexual trauma, neglect, disorganized types of behavior, around especially the parent-child relationship. And so the boundary has been broken in a very traumatic way, and so they're left reeling, trying to figure out how to figure out where they start and the other person, where they stop, the other person begins.
Yeah, and the path back to wholeness or to balanced, like healthy boundaries, often does look like putting up shields that appear like very rigid boundaries, understandably for a time, because they're protective, because you were hurt or taken advantage of. And then through the safe containers that we need to seek out in new relationships and in like therapeutic environments and things like that, we can start to try on the more healthy, balanced boundaries.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes in response to those same boundary violations, as you described, the pendulum will swing over to the rigid side, and people will just wall up, which is really hard because the ticket to intimacy is vulnerability. And it's really hard for us to be willing to be vulnerable if we don't feel safe.
Yeah.
So if our safety has been violated around vulnerability, we're unlikely to open ourselves up to get the intimacy that so many of us It's a fundamental human need that so many of us really, really want. So sometimes I'll have people come to me and are like, I don't have the relationships I want. I don't have the intimacy that I want. And everyone else is a butthead. Like, I hate everyone. I can't trust anybody. I'm like, well, it's no wonder you don't have the relationships that you want. You've got pretty hard boundaries there.
Yeah, and safety is kind of an inside job, an inside thing. We think about safe environments, and certainly that's a big factor. But you might feel safe in this environment, but I might feel unsafe right now, perhaps because of your beard is making me feel unsafe.
It's intimidating.
If it's triggering something in me. And I don't mean it is, Steve, but
that's good.
It's well sculpted.
If my beard is anything, it is well sculpted. Yes. Yeah, it's a good point. It's an inside job. I like the way you describe that. Because I think some of us make the mistake of outsourcing our safety to everyone else around us. Like, you need to make sure you don't trigger me. You need to make sure that I feel safe. And to some extent, we can't guarantee that we're not going to be hurt by others. It's a risk. Yeah. The vulnerability and intimacy game is a risky game to play, which kind of makes it exciting.
You open your heart, you will get hurt.
Yeah. Which, as I've said before, maybe on the show, is why, when it goes well, it is so delicious. It is so divine, because if everyone treated you well, the relationships where you are treated well wouldn't be as special. One of the things I really appreciate about my marriage is that it could be a shit show, and it's not. It's just that sort of contrast, that the fact that we could treat each other terribly and we don't makes it special.
Yeah, it's that age-old kind of paradox, or the suffering almost carves out this deep well where the love and bliss can be felt even more, or the opposite of some of these blissful things is often what lets us feel the bliss. And just like in relationship, you can't, there needs to be some space in your togetherness to really appreciate the togetherness. Yeah.
That's a good segue into other types of boundaries. So the segue being space, right? We have physical boundaries. We alluded to those. That's boundaries around, whether or not you are touched and how you were touched, and also physical proximity. Some people love sitting really, really close to them. One time, I was in line at Disneyland with my wife, and there was this guy who was literally a centimeter from her. And he seemed pretty oblivious as I was looking back to him. And she'd kind of inch up, and he would just inch right up behind her. And after a while, I was like, dude, can you back up? English wasn't his first language. I don't know if he didn't, understand me. And so he took half a step back and then slowly encroached up. I don't know if this guy was a super creeper guy or what, but so eventually we just stepped out of his way, and he went ahead of us in line and proceeded to, smell the hair of the person next to us in line. So this is a person who was violating our physical proximity boundaries.
He was from another planet.
It could be. He had that look in his eye.
He needed to get to the front of Disneyland line faster.
I think we were in the line for Buzz Lightyear or something like that. It wasn't.
It's a good ride. You get to shoot little guns at things on a screen.
I did enjoy that. Yeah. So it is. You have a right to protect those boundaries, to say, I'm not okay with being touched in that way. I'm not okay with being touched at all. Please take a step back, that kind of thing.
Yes is a complete sentence. Mm-hmm. And your body is indeed no one else's but your own. And right. These are truths we get dished out to us, throughout life and in young ages, but they're so important to check in with and reiterate the importance of in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a related boundary to physical is sexual boundaries. Mm-hmm. To that point, I remember in elementary school, they had this guy they called Officer Friendly, which in retrospect was kind of a weird name. You talk about these particular things, officer a little too friendly. But I remember him talking to us about touches and private parts. So from an early age, being taught sort of what the boundaries are around sexual contact. And of course, probably goes without saying, but we'll say it anyway. Consent, of course, is really, really important with respect to any kind of sexual contact. Mm-hmm. But even comments, right? Sexual comments or discussions about topics that you're uncomfortable with. you are perfectly within your rights to set those boundaries with other people.
Yeah. Did you ever see the show Portlandia?
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
There's this episode about a safe word in this relationship with Fred Arniston and I forget her name, but they come up with this word cacao as their safe word. And it's just this hilarious display of the use of safe word. And I think in the end, like, she's leaving the relationship, like, on the front steps, and he's like, cacao to leaving. trying to put a stop to that too.
Yeah, I love it. I kind of like the idea of safe words, actually, but yeah, I mean, again, you're right to consent, to define what kind of sexual touch you want, when, where, how, all those things.
It's kind of like what we do. I know this is a weird parallel to draw, but when we go over the appropriate use of touch going into psychedelic therapy sessions, we will give individuals, like, not only their sovereign right to decide then and at every moment throughout what is okay for them, but give them the easiest ways to ask for it or say no thanks, like whether it's holding out your hand or holding up your hand, things like that.
Right.
Yeah. Like a safe word.
Super important, right?
Yeah.
Like we've talked about before, especially in the psychedelic therapy session because of how vulnerable people are.
Yeah. In the yoga community, there's been a similar kind of much needed awareness around consent and boundaries, to the point where sometimes I've been in some yoga classes where there will be a little card of a yes, no, like an easy way of saying, yes, no, I agree to any hands-on adjustments, or no, thank you. Like, it's not what I'm feeling today.
I like that. That's really considerate. Other types of boundaries, we talked about sort of emotional, intellectual boundaries. You have a right to your opinions and your beliefs and to express them, hopefully, like we said before, with tact and timing. I don't like the idea of people who are just being, as I described before, a-holes, hiding behind this idea that, well, I have boundaries around my thoughts. I can say whatever I want. Well, you can. But there might be ways to deliver those messages that they're more likely to be received and understood. So I think we can be thoughtful around that. But
yeah, like the intellectual boundaries of today look like respecting others' ideas and opinions. And even if someone has the wildest alien conspiracy theory that you think is ridiculous, like, a healthy, like, you might be violating someone's boundary by belittling their idea that stems from a place of fear or wherever it comes from in them.
Yeah. A good antidote to that is to develop both cognitive and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy being, I can understand where you're coming from. Like, even though I totally disagree, I can imagine how you got to that conclusion, and I see that you came to it honestly. And then affective or emotional empathy being, I feel what you feel. I can feel what it's like to feel what you're experiencing. So they're different but related, and both important.
Yeah, and denying someone's reality is really not helpful, or it can be an unkind thing to do. We've learned that in both the trip sitting and harm reduction fields, and in dealing with individuals during psychotic episodes, for example. Not that dissimilar in many ways, but like when we had Zendo come out to Salt Lake City a couple years ago and do the harm reduction training, that was one of the things, is if someone's like seeing a big green dragon in front of them during the peak of their difficult experience on a psychedelic at Burning Man, the advice is it's not helpful to try and convince them that is not real. That is like what they're experiencing. And, there are ways of getting in there without, like, while still being like truthful and supportive, without like blatantly denying their reality and making it more difficult. Yeah.
This is such a pro tip for relationships and communicating at every level. Partnerships, parenting, like validating where other people are coming from without necessarily having to agree or enable, but just seeing them first. If I had to render probably the best parenting advice I could, it would be that for your kids. I can't tell you how many like fits I have de-escalated from my boys by first just saying, so you're feeling upset because of XYZ, yeah? And just a shoulder drop, yes, like they just want to be seen.
You're deflating this balloon every time you validate. Like in the emotion-focused therapy world, there's often this approach of like validate at least 3 times before you try to offer any kind of solution or get in there and offer help even.
It's really hard for those of us who are sort of literal linear thinkers, good at problem solving. You know, I have 2 brothers who are engineers. Sometimes they have a hard time seeing the emotion and they're like, it just doesn't make sense. Why are they doing what they're doing? It doesn't make sense. That hilarious YouTube video, It's Not About the Nail, is a really funny depiction of this. This woman has this giant like roofing nail in her forehead. And she's like, you know, my sweaters keep getting snagged. I've got a headache. And he's like, maybe it's not about the nail. She just wants him to see and have empathy for the emotional distress related to the nail.
It relates to that Maslow's pyramid or sailboat analogy, however it's constructed, is, you know, we have these innate needs to be seen and heard and understood, you know, even before the need for help fixing something. Yeah,
exactly. Before. So offer that to the people in your life first before you try to jump in and fix.
Seek first to understand. Yeah, and offer validation before even any reassurance. Like, it's okay. It's going to be okay. No, first it's like, I can understand why you would feel upset by XYZ because that sucks.
That's another really important point, is that a lot of people will rush to reassurance because they don't want you to feel bad or because they feel uncomfortable with your negative emotion. But reassurance can, not always, but it can be seen or received as invalidation.
Yeah.
You're going to be okay. You're fine.
I'm not going to be okay.
Yeah. I've been guilty of saying that. Like, kid falls down, scrapes his knee. You're fine. You're fine. But he's not.
Do I
he's
look
like,
fine?
Dad is telling me I'm fine. I'm clearly not fine. Do I have to be fine? Oh crap! Am I not allowed to cry? Am I not allowed to not be fine? I need to be fine all the time. And that's just, here we have started the process of repression.
Here's an ice cream cone to make you fine then. Yeah, no, there's some less than ideal ways that we culturally deal with emotions.
And if any of you are listening to this and feeling guilty, I'm right there with you. I have committed all these sins. Like you said earlier, we don't have to be perfect.
They're not even sins. They're human things that we do along our paths of learning and growth. And we're all figuring it out together. But you can confess your sins. It's okay. This is a safe
It's really
space.
why I started this podcast. It's just an avenue for me to confess my sins.
Yeah.
So thank you for everyone. Hopefully some of you have absolved me of my grievous sins.
You are forgiven.
Thank you. I almost crossed myself. That would be sacrilegious.
Cut that out.
Edit that out. Other types of boundaries, financial, material boundaries. The idea that nobody is entitled to your property, to your resources, that you get to decide how to dish that out and when to dish that out. I know there are so many nuances around this, and there's probably some opinions related to different cultural or economic systems related to financial resources. But I've had so many people in my office who are draining their bank accounts for people they feel like they have to take care of. And there might be some financial responsibility for people other than yourself, like family members, that you're doing it because you want to. But man, if you feel compelled to, and it leads to resentment, might be a sign of some poor boundaries around resources.
Yeah, I just thought of a random example of boundaries that may or may not be helpful, but I'll just share it. It was like a friend or family member, I'll protect their anonymity, who was with his wife, was going to drive to a quiet spot to make out, have a romantic moment, right? And then it's at night, and then this guy, it's on someone's property, but they had this place recommended by some friends, a nice peaceful spot. The guy comes out with a shotgun yelling at them and pointing at them, saying, "Get off my property." So, there's an example of maybe a little bit of a, for the guy, a little bit of a rigid boundary of getting a shotgun out immediately. And then this individual driving the car into someone's property, maybe they're shoring up their assessment of others' property in a healthy way. That's a little more towards the center and less porous, perhaps.
Yeah, you can imagine other ways, not knowing this particular man's history, and maybe these boundaries have been violated so aggressively that he feels like he has to meet any potential violation with that sort of level of aggression, sort of weapons-grade aggression.
Yeah, example of what we do inside with our various boundaries of various categories.
Like you've said on the podcast several times, if it's hysterical, it's historical.
If it's, yeah.
I think I got it right?
Yeah, you did. I was like, wait a second. If it's hysterical, it's historical. And when are we putting that on a shirt?
Somebody, I think it was either an email or an Instagram comment said, like, if you guys make merch, I'll buy it. Like, please make merch. It's just got to be cool.
If you want merch, comment, and maybe the merch will listen.
Yeah. Comment on the YouTube video if you're watching on YouTube, or you can email us. What's our new email address? ptfpodcast@numinous.com, I think.
There was this thing, and this is another tangent that may be completely unrelated. Maybe you can draw it back to boundaries, but someone sent me this Banksy post on like Instagram of showing a picture of how someone had taken his art, a big retailer, and put it on their fashion. It was in the window display. And he's like, since they stole my art, should we steal the clothes? Is that okay? Yeah, it was interesting.
It is interesting. So, that's probably an example of a boundary violation for a creator.
Yeah.
Somebody has appropriated or plagiarized or violated copyright or whatever your artwork without your permission. And so I think in a situation like that, it could be appropriate for legal action or, at least a statement from a lawyer saying, hey, you're not allowed to use my IP without permission or without a licensing agreement.
Yeah. And you're talking about like an adaptive anger kind of strategy versus
retaliation.
The anarchy of immediately grabbing the biggest stone you can and breaking the window is likely to get you in trouble, right? Even if it's like justifiable because your art was stolen, your boundary was violated. But this happens so much in people's rage. Like anger is such a valid, justifiable human emotion that is there in large part to protect our boundaries. But we can show up in a reactive, maladaptive way with our anger and act without bringing like the mind and heart together and thinking of like what is the most loving thing that still protects these boundaries. Or you can like react and self-destruct and end up like punching someone and find yourself in jail when you were just wanting to protect a boundary but not doing it in an adaptive way.
Yeah. Are you using an atom bomb when a stern voice would do?
Yeah.
Because an atom bomb will create a lot of collateral damage in your life and the lives of others. We should also set boundaries around our time.
Yeah.
How we spend our time, who we spend it with. This is a huge issue for people you referred to earlier who feel like they have to say yes to everything. They have to volunteer for PTA or for the kids' soccer team, or pretty soon, like we described earlier, the cup's empty and they got nothing for themselves.
Or anyone who has an email inbox. The perfect example of boundaries. Like at this point in my inbox, I have given up the idea of inbox zero, right? And spam, I can't plug all the holes that come in, but I can decide what I give my attention to. And even besides the spam, like email's so interesting because we'll have people reach out asking for something or asking for time or maybe wanting you to do their job or ask the same question over and over. And it's easy for us to take it on and feel guilt and feel like we're not like doing it right if we haven't successfully replied to everyone who ever messages us. But that's a porous boundary, right? Big time, where like it is up to you to dictate your life and prioritize how you spend it. And if you don't, someone else will, and it's not going to be your life. You're not captaining your ship anymore.
Right. One way I've set a boundary personally around that is I am no longer Google's middleman. So if you have a question that could easily be answered by a 10-second Google search, don't ask me that question. Unless it's like really, really specific to my job or a contract that we have together or whatever, then of course. But just simple things, maybe you're asking me because you want to connect with me and that's different. You want to have a personal connection.
They're flirting.
Yeah, I love being flirted with. Please flirt with me. But if it's easily Googleable, if I had to Google it to answer your question, then take me out of the middle.
I have a passive aggressive pro tip for you.
Oh, please.
There's a website called, let me Google that for you. LMGTFY, whatever. You guys know how to spell better than I do. Let me Google that for you. You plug in the search term, and then it will give you a link that takes them to an animated version of the web page that shows you typing it in and doing the search for them. And so they're like, oh, burn.
Yes, that is delightful.
We can link to it in the show notes.
That is super passive aggressive, but sometimes it's called for. Yeah, those are the types of boundaries, the sort of categories of boundaries I can think of. Anything I missed?
No, but I would recommend as a practice, and we do this sometimes with people in like retreat settings and therapist training, is trying these categories of boundaries on with every area and person in your life of importance. Like you might think of a loved one and then go through those categories. Like, how am I, say it's your intimate relationship, your life partner. How am I doing in the physical boundaries relationship? Porous, rigid, healthy. And it's not always a very cut and dry, black and white, and these are ever shifting things. But like taking an inventory means awareness, and awareness means like, the ability to set it up in a way that's best. How am I doing in intellectual boundaries, respecting their ideas versus belittling, or how do I feel my ideas are handled, emotional, sexual, material stuff, and time.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure this exercise goes by many names, but I like to call it the boundary integrity check.
Yeah.
And I like the word integrity because it implies like structural integrity. How is the integrity of the wall that is my boundary too porous, too rigid? And also integrity in the sense is my behavior aligned with my values? Is it aligned with my internal sense of self, my connection to higher self, to my aspirational or transcendent self? So it's an integrity boundary check. And like you described, you can do this with everybody in your life.
Yeah. And then you can look at what is the ideal boundary situation look like, and you can visualize that. You can write that down. You can start practicing towards that. You can plant that seed in the quantum field like Joe Dispenza might tell you to do, and have it flourish and manifest in all its energetic glory.
Yes, tune yourself to a higher vibrational energy, and all will be yours.
Different ways of saying the same thing. I like to poke your quantum buttons, but it's, like things are created first in the energetic ether in a way, in our minds and our hearts, and then we practice them. And
I always feel compelled to make the caveat that I think Joe has helped thousands of people, and I think a lot of his stuff is really, really good. And there's much about the quantum that we don't understand. Most of the quantum we don't understand, I think. Certainly I don't.
Yeah. Sparks, quarks, spin of electrons.
String theory, quantum entanglement, all that stuff.
String theory, I mean, it's pretty cool. It's like this table could be you if the vibrations were pointed in a different direction. Like matter is what it shows up as because of the magnetic field, the spin of its electrons, and the string theory.
Yeah. I mean, just the idea that we are made of the same molecules and atoms as everything else sort of blows my mind, and that we were all forged in the heart of dying stars, of like neutron stars and things. That's crazy. That the particular combination of atoms of a human organism gives rise to consciousness, or is the vessel within which this eternal soul is implanted. Whatever, I don't know how it works. But I tend to contemplate and enjoy contemplating the great mystery.
Yeah, I had a psychedelic ceremony earlier this year where that was one of the kind of insights or things that came up, was like, oh, wow, myself is not just limited by my physical boundaries of my human body and skin. And I mean, we know this even medically and scientifically. Like you can measure an EKG by putting leads on your heart, and there's electricity that emanates, like our brains.
Brainwaves.
Yeah. You put a little helmet on and measure your brainwave activity, but thinking of the consciousness that we don't fully understand, and thinking of the energetic exchange between everyone you collide with in life, and the reaction that ensues, even if there's no physical collision, is really interesting.
Yeah. And the idea of quantum, this is so off topic, but the idea of quantum entanglement applied to humans, to me, is really fascinating. Like you have people who feel prompted to call their loved one because, something's going on. and it was serendipitous. Like, oh my gosh, how did you know? Or twins who sort of feel each other from a distance. Is there some, at the molecular level, there's some kind of quantum vibration that's connecting us? Maybe.
Yeah. And I mean, it is pretty relevant to the psychedelic experience, at least, of like an experience with the numinous is an experience with like the felt presence of the divine in your life. And, you know, I heard, I think it was from a book that Hannah is reading about by Yaden on the mystical experience, talking about how maybe 25% of people report having an experience with the numinous in their life ever. And it's really neat to think about how these things can get occasioned by, of course, certain contemplative practices and disciplined paths, but also by taking a dose of psilocybin, occasioning a mystical experience that people report as one of the most meaningful things they've ever experienced.
Yeah, it alters the signal of this antenna that is the human mind, and you receive different wavelengths.
Yeah.
And so you see things differently. And my encounters, at least recently, my most intimate encounters with the numinous have been on psychedelic medicine sessions.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting to look at from a lens of boundaries, because we dissolve our egos and make them more porous, perhaps because we have too rigid ego boundaries in our people suits as we go through life, and don't always appreciate the interconnectedness of us all without going into overly porous land of like all the things we've talked about. But there is something beautiful about appreciating the porous nature of our like spiritual boundaries and the oneness that exists out there.
Yeah. I was meditating with Sam Harris's Waking Up app this morning, and he was guiding us on this meditation where we, with our eyes open, we widen, soften our field of view. We're taking in the whole world. And then he had us breathe, where we're breathing in the world and then breathing ourselves out into the world. And he's all about this sort of inflection point when you make the shift of noticing where the I is. You know, this is trying to get you into non-dual consciousness, this idea that self is an illusion, actually.
Slip into the observer.
Yeah. And consciousness is infinitely expansive. There are no containers to consciousness.
Yeah, your observer might be in your skull, or more often it's like somewhere in and around you observing yourself, or you might be doing that from outer space, astrally traveling.
Yeah. That's one of the trippy things about that kind of meditation. He has a whole series called The Headless Way, where it's sort of helping you get out of this idea, or from this felt sense that you are behind your eyes, that you are behind your face, that the sense of you is an illusion, and its consciousness, as I said before, is borderless.
Boundary stuff.
It's related to boundaries. We tied it back.
You need, like we've said, the Zen masters teach, you need enough ego so you don't get hit by a bus.
I don't want to be hit by a bus. I love the ego for that.
Thank you, ego.
Yeah. I remember one time in a ketamine treatment, I had experienced, you know, ketamine's very, they call it a dissociative anesthetic. It's great for giving you that experience of boundarylessness. And felt like my body had been, you know, blasted apart into many different pieces and was all about the universe. And then I encountered Steve as a construct. I was like, Steve. Who or what is this Steve? And I could evaluate my sense of self, my ego's identification with self, from a distance, from this observer perspective, and see that a lot of what I had come up with that was me was arbitrary, or the result of old conditioning and old narratives, old stories, unconscious contracts. And then I got to say, you know what? I kind of like this construct that is Steve. Not a bad guy. It was a wonderful exercise in seeing myself and then loving myself.
So you could actually come back to the construct that is Steve and go about your life. You should change your bio to Steve as a construct or something like that.
I should. I like that. Well, any other closing thoughts around boundaries?
No. Nope.
A couple of books I will recommend, and I'll link to these in the show notes. Good about how to communicate with people who continually violate our boundaries, or exploring your own boundaries. Talking to Crazy by the psychiatrist Mark Goulston is a good one. Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson. That's that one, and the next one, Children of the Self-Absorbed by Nita Brown. They're good ones to explore how maybe childhood origin complications, relationships with parents who were wounded and therefore didn't treat us well, could have contributed to your struggle to make or maintain healthy boundaries. Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. He's a FBI hostage negotiator, or CIA, one of the two, one of those three-letter organizations, hostage negotiator. Just interesting book on how to communicate with others when they're not being rational. Appropriately named Boundaries by Anne Catherine. No More Mr. Nice Guy by Robert Glover, one of my favorites, especially for men. And then Codependent No More by Melody Beattie.
Yeah, that's a good one. And okay, fine, I will share a closing thought. If you don't set your priorities, someone else will for you. Just a reminder, a public service announcement. And if you don't maintain your boundaries, no one else will. This is really up to us. And it's so important to check in with and figure out your boundaries, what's right for you. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Reid.
Thank you.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinous at numinous.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.